What I'm going to talk to you about today is the kind of, it's been a bunch of ideas that have been knocking around my head for the last couple of years while I try and squeeze the last remnants of publications out of my PhD, the book of which is at the back of the room on the exhibition type table. So I kind of come from a protest movement journalism studies background, but I started teaching a module on sport and the media, and I've seen a lot of commonalities between social movement study and the kind of things that they point out and these kind of fan movements. So what I'll be looking at is I'll give some high-profile examples of some really quick and dirty analysis of some fan activism, particularly against owners of certain clubs. But I'll also highlight the importance of sport and the news media in all of this, and I'll talk through some ideas and approaches that are quite useful to use from social movement studies and how each of these protests were covered. Well, what we're kind of dealing with here with the difference in fandom and ownership is you have the so-called kind of like traditional industrial era geography, working class sensibilities and tradition, and the club as being representative of things like leisure time, camaraderie, local identity, but also an expression of pride in one's home, town, or city. Football is kind of like a ritual every other week, and the stadium is the altar. It's quite handy that being out the window. And then you have, up against this, you have modern football with its multi-billion-pound broadcasting deals, high commercialization, and the shunting of this kind of idyllic perception of football into the age of the mega spectacle. So you almost have football as a kind of a consumer entertainment product. You can buy into it. You don't necessarily have to have the same kind of traditional ties. Now, where protests and social movements come into all this, well, football fan protests, they're very similar to, say, other forms of protest in maybe the environmental or even the anti-capitalist type movements, because they carry a lot of symbolism and they also have spectacle attached to them. And you'll see some similar tactics coming through as well. So whether it's something as simple as like a message written on a bed sheet, or a professionally produced banner being flown across the sky by a small plane, or even walkouts at particular symbolic times which represent a club's most important date. And it's like symbolism is attached to all these things. Now, how this might get covered is to talk a little bit about the relationship between the press and football as a sport in general. So what you have is the industries are very similar, they're both businesses, but they often have a quite complementary, conflictual, and very complex relationship because of the importance of football especially in trying to generate news media content. And ultimately you get a mixture of niceties and nastiness. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples of this. So when Sir Alex Ferguson retired in his final press conference, now even though he had given out some very savage treatment to members of the press corps over the years, the Sun, Neil Custis in particular, they presented Alex Ferguson with a cake which was representative of their front page the day after Fergie announced his retirement. So, you know, they gave him a cake with a hairdryer on it. And in total, in the daily newspapers published in England, there are 175 pages dedicated to Alex Ferguson's retirement. So yeah, niceties, very high up on the agenda. But with the clubs, that is where the power lies. So they're more powerful gatekeepers to information, especially in the age of social media, than perhaps politicians or even corporations could ever be. So Ferguson himself refused to speak to the BBC between 2004 and 2011 because of the BBC documentary about his son, Jason. So he just point blank stonewalled them. Newcastle, they banned the Daily Telegraph from St. James's Park after they published an article about dressing room unrest. Now, staying with Newcastle, in late 2015, they created so-called preferred media outlets, which is something which is fairly unprecedented, especially at a higher level. And what that meant is that they gave particular media outlets preferential treatment and access to things like the club, players, and the manager. So really, really kind of like drawing particular media outlets in. And it's an attempt to try and control the perceptions, how they're being reported. So for example, when Channel 4's Alex Thompson, he was banned from a press conference at Newcastle United because he wanted to ask questions about the banning of journalists. So you couldn't even make some of this stuff up. So this attempt to just try and control the narrative. But what impact does this idea of like preferred status have? Well, here is when McLaren was given the job of Newcastle manager. Admittedly, it was fairly short-lived. So this is how the various newspapers covered it. And hopefully, it's quite obvious to you who the preferred media outlet was. So Sky Sports News is one of them. The other one was the Mirror Sport. And I'll come back to speak about the Mirror in a bit. But what this shows you an example of is an idea about media framing, which Gamson talks about as like being a picture frame. It puts a border around something, it spotlights certain events, and it focuses on their underlying causes, but it directs our attention away from others. So how something is framed in the media, especially in protest, kind of displays the narrative and the interpretation of these particular events. Now, in terms of protest and the press, getting a campaign into the media puts a group in a better position to try and provoke debate and provoke a reaction from their protest targets. So to try and get some kind of change made. And the media attention on football especially acts as a perfect platform for trying to highlight certain issues. So this image, for instance, shows when Greenpeace activists were protesting against the Russian energy giant Gazprom. I think it was during a Zenit St. Petersburg Schalke game, who were both sponsored by Gazprom. So they were using football as a platform for their campaign, and they're trying to undermine Gazprom through media visibility. What their banners say is, "Don't foul the Arctic." I mean, Greenpeace are very good at this thing. But the media isn't the only one to do this kind of framing. You also have protester framing. I mean, that's an image taken from Occupy St. Paul's. So protest uses what Snow and Benford referred to as collective action frames. So by the very definition, they operate by focusing on the seriousness of an issue and trying to identify those who are responsible. But as the name suggests, it promotes a collective, unified view of the world. And another important point to make is that many of these football fan groups, as Mark mentioned earlier, they're connected to each other. So you have organizations like Stand Against Modern Football or the campaigns against ticket prices. And that's led me to think about this and see how these football fan movements really fit in to the very definitions of what could be used to label a social movement. Because you do get some disciplines which might get a bit sniffy about sport, and especially when you look at protests through things like environmental and anti-capitalist, but this is a movement. And it's because it's a network of individuals, groups, or organizations, and they're condensing around a common purpose and a shared identity. In this case, it's the clubs. And they want to challenge and interact with their targets, and they use very conventional and unconventional acts. Some of their tactics I'll talk through as well. And they do this in order to achieve specific movement goals. So for instance, this image of the goalkeeper trying to catch a pig is from a game between Coventry and Charlton. So both sets of fans were protesting their respective owners. And they threw, I think it was about 8,000 pigs onto the pitch just to show the greed in the sport. So it's very much connected, and fans are coming together across boundaries. I always try a lot to try and visualize these kind of things in images and how all of this comes together. And as serendipity works, I was looking at an article about mobilization of indigenous people in Brazil who were protesting over land rights. Obviously, not necessarily to do with football, but it kind of fits rather neatly to show how these things are structured and how they interact. So on the left, you have like the structure of a movement. So you have the individual campaigns. So you have the movement, the big one, campaigns just in. So you have the overall campaigns, like around ticket prices. Then you go even more micro, and you have the various protest events. So if you think about ticket prices, you have things like the walkouts at Liverpool on the 77th minute against the £77 ticket price. Or Bayern fans delaying taking to the pitch for 5 minutes in a protest at the cost of going to see Arsenal Bayern Munich. Now the right-hand image takes these protest events and looks at what kind of impact they might have and the kind of influence it has on things like decision makers and the protest targets. And in the middle, you have things like public opinion. What do people think about this stuff? You have the mass media and you have social media. And these kind of things all have an influence on each other. It's probably a bit more cyclical than that there, but that's how these kind of things play out. Now on to the case studies. The first one I'd like to talk about is Blackpool. And what you'll see from these case studies that I'm going to show you, the commonality is that they're protesting against owners who were originally seen as saviors for these particular clubs. But for reasons I'm going to go into, the fans have turned on them. So the first one is Blackpool. Owned by the Oyston family since 1987, and since saving the club from going bust. In 2010-11, Blackpool played in the Premier League for the first and only time. And they were then relegated. And 2 weeks before the 2014-15 season, they only had 8 registered players, so they fell quite quickly. And unsurprisingly, they were relegated again, currently sit in, I think, League One. Now, the TV money from the Premier League wasn't reinvested in the club. Moreover, some of it was siphoned off and ended up in the son, the younger Oyston, his own company's bank accounts to the tune of 11 million quid. So he was seen as siphoning money off from the club. And quite obviously, this alienated the owner from the fans themselves. So that kind of prompted a lot of distrust in the ownership and a lack of any kind of investment. So that led to fan protests. They conducted walkouts. They even conducted more direct actions, such as throwing tangerines and tennis balls onto the pitch, tangerines being the nickname of the club itself. But if you look at the images of the protest, it's quite clear who they're focusing on. They're focusing on Carl Oyston in particular, with the Oyston out, lots of Oyston out scarves as well. Funnily enough, that car there is Carl Oyston's own car, and his number plate is like Oysy out, so he was kind of playing on it too. These are not very particularly tasteful individuals. Now the local paper, the reason I mention local newspapers is because they still have this local beat and they still cover local sport. Because what these clubs I'm talking about have in common is none of them at the minute are Premier League. So the local paper is almost where you get your information from. And the Blackpool Gazette generally took quite a non-confrontational stance towards the club. But as the years went by and the protests have grown and become more frequent, the paper's viewpoint hardened on calling Oyston to invest for the sake of the fans. Now, they've given the protest a lot of coverage. And while the paper might not be, explicitly in support of the protest at times, by just featuring them in the newspapers, it displays a kind of tacit level of support. If we move on to the next one, obviously near from where I live. So Vincent Tan buys Cardiff, clears all the debts, seen as a saviour, but it has quite a high-profile conflict with the fans because he wants to change the colour of the shirt from blue to red. He actually had a conversation with the fans and said he wasn't going to do it, but he did it anyway. And this prompted kind of unrest within the fans. But then they got promoted to the Premier League. So you had a split amongst the fans. Some saw him as being like a saviour and taking the club to where they want to be. Others saw him as like denying the club's history with the colour and especially the badge, and being as like a real enemy to the club. Now the newspaper at this point, when they moved up to the Premier League, they took a very neutral stance. But as the protests began to happen and the club were relegated and got bigger and bigger, the newspaper changed its stance. And that's the front cover of the newspaper. Now, moving from the back page to the front page, it kind of takes this story beyond the confines of sport. So it makes it a front page issue, which obviously has an increased importance to it. You also have like Newcastle, you have Mike Ashley, who amongst other things, he sacks Kevin Keegan, he hires Dennis Wise, he changes the name of the stadium to the Sports Direct Stadium. Now protests against the Ashley regime have followed a similar pattern, like in the ground, around the ground, but also against his Sports Direct empire as well. Now, in stark contrast to the other newspapers, the Newcastle Chronicle has been incredibly confrontational towards Ashley. And this stance led Ashley to banning the Chronicle from the club, saying that they unacceptably disproportionate level of coverage given to these particular protests. And that seemingly only made the paper much more anti-Ashley. But as I mentioned, the Daily Mirror as being a preferred outlet, the Chronicle is owned by the same parent company. So you have two competing papers in the region. One has preferred access, the other does not. I'll give a special mention to Charlton. 1 minute? Fine. Who have been incredibly inventive. They sent a taxi to Roland Duchalet's hometown in Belgium to show the people where he lives, what he's been doing to the football club. They sent a letter to Company's House declaring that one of the directors had resigned. I think they just basically forged her signature, which Company's House then accepted. They were like, why would we question this kind of thing? And the protests themselves actually led to Burnley having to celebrate with an inflatable version of the championship trophy because of fears of fan disruption. I mean, what the lasting kind of impact that these protests have, I mean, the Oystons are still in charge. Cardiff City upon relegation, Vincent Tan is still there. And he changed the shirt back after he said having counsel with his mum. But it might have been an attendance of 4,000 at an FA Cup third round match. Mike Ashley appeared on TV towards the end of the 14-15 season and vowed not to go anywhere until the club won a trophy. Now, to wrap all this up, if you consider yourself a fan of a particular football club, you're not just necessarily a fan of football as a sport. By the very nature, you're more than just a passive consumer of these kind of things. And that's highlighted if you look at any of the protest literature from any of these groups, the use of things like us and we. And these owners are seen as custodians rather than, you know, being like CEOs of big companies. It's like the fans will always be there, but owners will come and go. And so football in these instances is being used in two different ways. One is it's a condensing point to highlight contentious issues. And two, protesters are using the media spectacle which surrounds football to try and pressurize these owners into just making some kind of changes. But the fans are making some gains here and there, but the fight obviously continues. Thank you for listening.